They'll also be in the Western Maryland area for probably the rest of the month. So, chance to see them. And food in the back, I baked for our final lecture of the year. I'm very happy to have you all here. Apple cake, Boston brown bread with hazelnuts, and some German-themed cookies in keeping with our history here in Hagerstown. And we are a few minutes early, but if you want to get started, I think after all this back and forth, I'm going to make an introduction. Most of you already know who is here to speak, but I will introduce him anyway. Tonight's speaker, Frank Milihram, is a native of Hagerstown, and having spent his whole life in and around the community, he developed a passion and interest in its history and the many stories of its citizens. It should be no surprise then that Hagerstown has served as an incubator for his scholarly and professional pursuits. In 2022, Frank graduated with a BA in Historic Preservation and Public History from Shepherd University. He then earned his MA in Historical Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in May 2024. And I'm proud to say that I helped with the thesis.
Big time.
Big time, okay, medium time. Frank's also worked as a public historian last summer and contributed to the continuing growth of the Fort Ritchie History Museum in Cascade, which is really great. So when you get a chance, take a little drive to Cascade. It's a very pretty drive and a really great museum. And if there's time at the end tonight, before you go, ask Frank about his work in Washington, D.C., researching beer, ale, and lager. We will have something to tell you about that.
Oh, I will indeed. I will indeed. Those of you who know.
Please take it away, Frank.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for coming out to my talk this evening. More to Hagerstown that meets the eye. Stories of the post-industrial community. The very original title, which I had actually ripped off of I believe it was a Baltimore Sun article that I found during my research. And while I don't think I ever used it in my thesis, I found it stuck with me for some reason. And for this version of my talk, at least condensing my research that I've compiled over the last 2 to 3 years for my thesis, I recommend reading it at some point because tonight, like I said, will be the diet version where I picked out what I thought was the most important and presented it in a more digestible way because there's a lot of academic, whatever colorful descriptive you want to use for that, but be that as it may, fill in the blank. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? So first and foremost, I want to dedicate this presentation and really just the whole thing in general in a way to Terry Plunkett. Mr. Plunkett was a great man, and he was instrumental in making this successful. In fact, actually, he is the reason why I decided to go the oral history route, as you will see. Mr. Plunkett worked at Fairchild for a couple of years, but of course, as you'll see too, the things that he did after his time at Fairchild were what I focused on. Fortunately, Mr. Plunkett had endured a short but brave battle with leukemia this past summer, and he is not able to make it with us this evening. However, he did get a chance to read my thesis upon its completion, and I received the highest praises and whatnot from him on that, and I couldn't have asked for anything better. So yes, needless to say, great man, lots of history, was more than happy to share his time and his stories with me, and without him or without that, this definitely, I wouldn't be standing here talking about it today. I would probably just find something else. Now on that note as well, before we really get into it, I just want to quickly say that if you were coming here tonight to hear another history, or I don't know how much you as individuals know about each of the two firms and whatnot that I will be talking about, but it deviates from the norm. And I'll stop talking about that now, and maybe I just want you to keep an open mind because a lot of this stuff is new. As far as when I did a lot of my research, I had a very, very hard time finding any of this information anywhere else other than in the rawest form of newspaper articles and other primary sources. so hopefully you all will get some enjoyment out of that. All right, August 30th, 1983. While Americans who read beyond the first page of the newspaper might have had the idea of what was going on in Hagerstown, Maryland at the time, the people of Hagerstown sure enough did. Fairchild Republic, a long time and important industry in the city, was closing its doors forever, citing poor economic conditions and contract problems with various customers such as the United States Air Force and Boeing. They realized that there was no more work to be given to the Hagerstown plant, one that had been here since the year 1929, and looking at it more broadly speaking, the aviation industry had been here since just before the end of World War I, kind of coming to age with the city of Hagerstown, but now that was coming to an end. In fact, when it closed, many of the people who found out that they were being laid off had 40s hire dates on their documentation. That is correct. That means they were hired in the 1940s and had been working there at the very least 40 years at that point. However, this was only the beginning of a larger story. Less than 10 years later, Hagerstown once again experienced a great industrial loss in the form of MP Moller pipework. MP Moller pipeworking was founded in 1875 by Danish immigrant mathematician Peter Moller in nearby Greencastle, Pennsylvania, and 6 years later, Moller moved his factory to Hagerstown, Maryland. In a rather long series of issues that I will get into in just a little bit, Moller's story ended in bankruptcy and failed when the plans to revive the company failed. As you see here on this newspaper, its ultimate end pretty much can be surmised in 1992. Employees at the time who worked there could proudly claim that it was the world's largest pipeworking manufacturer in the world, which saying that there was about 200 employees at the time should say something about the pipeworking industry as a whole, but that's another story. So while community members were truly sad to see these institutions leave Hagerstown, the more than 1,000 employees who were soon to be out of a job undoubtedly felt much worse. While some would try to tough it out despite the poor economic conditions that seemed to be consuming much of Western Maryland at the time, that is the 80s and 90s, others felt that they had to leave Hagerstown to find work somewhere else. After all, memories and nostalgia do not pay the bills. This was a solid blow overall, too, to the working class of Hagerstown, Maryland. Problems like this had hit them before, albeit at not such a level of totality. Not only did these two groups of workers lose their source of income, they also certainly started to feel that they lost a part of themselves. They lost a part of their identity. The phenomenon that I just described was not unique to Hagerstown, nor was it even unique to the state of Maryland. In the 20th century, American workers and their communities across the country were faced with grim realities of what became known as deindustrialization, as a pilot good definition up there. But for the sake of Hagerstown, deindustrialization occurred when a specific area or region, that is Hagerstown, loses its basic industrial capabilities, usually in the form of manufacturing or similar forms of production. That is MP Moller pipeworking and Fairchild Industries. While this narrative has been covered in other Rust Belt cities like Youngstown, Ohio, or Detroit, Michigan, Hagerstown's experience is yet to be considered. In fact, as far as Hagerstown is concerned, the story usually ends here. The factory closes and so does the book. In this case, the closure of these plants was only the beginning of a much wider and involved story. So drawing on interviews, news coverage, and historical records, this project explores how Hagerstown's working class identity has evolved since the loss of major industries. It shows how the closure of factories changed how workers saw themselves and their community. And in the wake of deindustrialization, people responded in 4 key ways, which I'll give you a flavor of tonight. And that is resisting a sense of victimhood, grieving things that were lost, rethinking the meaning of work, and creating a new shared memory of life after industry. And that is everything that occurs after the factory is closed. as you see here, the document, or the definition, and the two newspaper articles that, don't know if you can tell from the quality of the picture, I had to use my phone to just take a picture of the screen on the old microfilm. That was the only place I could find it. So part of that, but the headline is what's important. So in the beginning and the end, as I kind of highlighted at the beginning, this is not just another story of the history of MP Moller, the history of Fairchild. There's plenty of other places in the city and plenty of other books and historians who've done an excellent job of covering that. What I'm going to provide with you tonight is a background for those of you who don't necessarily know, and more so a background on things that may not be as familiar with the company's history, that is things that occurred after World War II. Even still, this story is a little incomplete. No one has really delved into that aspect of this city's history either, which understandably so is very niche. So I'll do the best to paint as good of a picture as I can and to give you, like I said, enough context to understand things that occur after that. As you'll see up here on the slideshow here, I picked a series of 4 pictures, and it's important to note the contrast here is that top MP Moller on the left, and the bottom is Fairchild on the bottom left as well. Those are pictures I find I would describe as the heyday, or when things were going really well. The other side is, well, the exact opposite of that. After the closure, as you can see with the old Moller building out there on Prospect Street, it's seen better days. Thankfully, in terms of the old Fairchild plant, the Museum of Aviation is out there now taking good care of it. So think about that as we go forward. So Hagerstown, as I'm sure many of you know, is very rural. It's in Appalachia, and its economy has always struggled due to this isolation as well as other factors. It's an inherent issue that's unfortunately, you could say plagued in one sense, but that's not always the case. People seem to make do. But compared to the rest of the country, it's been relatively more poor compared to other areas. Despite this, Hagerstown has always had some kind of industrial base, and especially with the arrival of the railroads and the Industrial Revolution, this has become especially so. So this industrial base that came to Hagerstown that followed the railroads and other things would continue to grow basically until it came to its peak during World War II and immediate post-war period, where every single industry was pulling its weight for the war effort. As a matter of fact, the Hagerstown system, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, where all the local industries pulled their efforts to contribute to Fairchild's war effort, that is building airplanes and other things, was a system that was copied nationally. And I mean, as I just said, it was known as the Hagerstown system because it was perfected here. After this peak time, that I would say, where Fairchild was employing around 10,000 people, and at Moller's peak during the war, it employed about 4,000 people, if my numbers are correct. Things began a gradual decline. Not to say that these industries weren't important in their own respects. It's to say that from that point on, we never got any higher as far as output, production, and similar statistics. Complicated economics is a good way to describe Hagerstown in the 50s, 60s, and on. To give you a little bit of the picture, in 1961, the Mack truck plant arrived here in Hagerstown from New Jersey. It actually moved, and there was some drama that went on with that, but again, that's another story. At the same time, you would think, wow, a whole new industry, a whole new plant is moving here, and one that would at one point take Fairchild's title as the largest employer in the county. At the same time, in 1961, the Kennedy administration deemed Hagerstown to be a quote-unquote depressed area based on unemployment and overall economic output. You were a Republican in that time period, you certainly were not happy to hear that Mr. Kennedy was calling your hometown a depressed area. But unfortunately, the statistics did not lie in that regard. Now, moving on to some of the more specific firms, there's a few specific firms I'm talking about tonight. We have Fairchild Industries, Fairchild Aircraft, Fairchild Republic, went by many names over the course of its time. As long as you're talking about Fairchild, I know what you're talking about, so it's good enough for me. So Fairchild's issues actually start a little before World War II, but definitely during World War II, and then the plight, as I might like to call it, kind of starts to rear its head in those years. Fairchild's dependence on government contracts and onward was the first symptom of decline, and that would result in the work having its peaks and valleys, especially when, in this case, in the post-war years, Fairchild saw diversification of its business. Missiles, satellites, even doorknobs. It into a lot of things that may have been aviation related, but some of them, like the doorknob part, definitely stretch. With sometimes their goal being actually to get, and they're eventually successful at it, was to get out of the aviation industry altogether. This especially occurred under, at the time of the early 60s, the newly minted president, Edward Buell, an important character that we'll research later, who helped the company acquire other companies, notably Hiller Helicopter and Republic Aviation, hence the name. At that point, it would become a conglomerate. It would achieve conglomerate status, which, on my research, is not necessarily a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. If you're looking at it from the business executive, business standpoint, that's great, making more money, making more things, everybody's happy in that regard. However, conglomerate status can come with a host of problems, especially depending on what type of managerial style you're running. From research in general industries at the time, post-war decisions especially, a lot of the quote-unquote foreign competition was actually funded by that very company itself. For example, Goodyear Tires, the rubber company, was actively funding and, I should say, investing in foreign competition that they like to always claim was the exact issue. Whether that had been Michelin or other similar companies overseas, they were, as I said, actively funding their competition. I was not able to find anything necessarily pointing that Fairchild did that same thing, but the biggest thing, as you'll see, is going to be government contracts coming up and going away, and other similar issues. So despite the sometimes turbulent existence of Fairchild's business strategy, Fairchild was still a very important source of work for Hagerstown, even with its big layoffs and oftentimes big hires, gambling at sometimes on government contracts. Not everyone always had the same mindset, though, especially in this community, that Fairchild wasn't necessarily a good thing. To quote one concerned citizen, Hagerstown grew and prospered 30 years or more ago, before Fairchild. It is questionable and debatable that the past 30 years have been good for Hagerstown. A multitude of people of different classes, ranging from state officials, county officials, even down to the assembly line worker, thought the town was too dependent on Fairchild, too dependent on one major industry for its jobs, and they had their points. Now, as I said, things continued to have that pattern until the year 1973, when people thought that the goose had laid the golden egg, in the sense that Fairchild had acquired the A-10 Thunderbolt II contract and would be manufacturing these aircraft in full by the mid-1970s. To some of the region, the A-10 represented, as I said, the goose that laid the golden egg. One Baltimore Sun article reported, but to a good many workers in the Western Maryland community, where unemployment has hovered around 12% much of this year, the A-10 is a guardian angel offering jobs now and in years to come. That with the A-10 contract, Boeing would also arrange a contract deal with Hagerstown to supply basically sub-assemblies of the 757, I believe, either that or the 727. And Fairchild executives and workers alike at times thought that this would provide enough work to last well into the 1980s, allowing surely another contract to come along. Surely, I wish that was the case, but unfortunately, things don't always work out that smoothly in history. And with that, even though they had secured these contracts, other things began to take hold. For example, in April of 1983, Fairchild was found guilty on 5 counts of dumping untreated wastewater from its Hagerstown plant directly into the ground, pollution that seeped into the area's groundwater. Originally, the company faced 86 charges, but the judge and grand jury only showed 5 counts of clear negligence. In those cases, workers actually knew that contaminated water was being dumped, and they had tried to warn management, but those warnings were ignored. But the story doesn't end there. Just before the trial even started, 4 Fairchild foremen filed a lawsuit against the company. They argued that they had been suspended to keep quiet during the investigation, and that Fairchild was trying to make them take the fall for these violations. Their suit even named 2 top officials, company chairman Edward Yule and Hagerstown plant manager Marion Bud Miller, another important name to keep in mind. Meanwhile, Fairchild leadership continued to insist the company had done nothing wrong. Yule even told the Washington Post that he was prepared to drink the water that had been dumped. In contrast, Maryland's Attorney General Stephen Sachs was praised for pushing the case forward, saying that no state should ignore violations that put public health at risk. Ultimately, Fairchild paid a $100,000 fine, the highest fine for this type of environmental issue at the time in the state of Maryland. The Yule maintained that the company was innocent. In an odd twist, announced that the same day Fairchild would move its headquarters in Germantown, Maryland, to nearby Virginia. The more I've studied history, the more I've thought that coincidences are not necessarily a sure thing. So Fairchild, that brings us up to the closure. Only a few months after this dramatic trial, Fairchild announced that there would be no more work for Hagerstown plant following the last A10 in March 1984. I couldn't find the quote, but I remember reading at one point that someone up at the Fairchild leadership even said that even if there was more work to be given, it would not be billed out to Hagerstown. Following the closure of the main plant, Fairchild's bonding facility just outside was still up and running and owned by them until the year 1987, when it was sold off to Rohr and later to D.F. Goodrich, ending the long and important heritage of Fairchild here in the city of Hagerstown. So now we move on to MP Moller at this time and how they got to where they got. As I said, founded by a Danish immigrant, it was really a craft-based industry. I mean, to really appreciate it, all these things, I mean, from cutting the wood to rolling the pipes and the raw materials, was all done in-house at the Moller factory. Very few things were brought in from outside, so of course we'll get more towards the end of the story, but it's been really important to emphasize that artistry that went on in MP Moller. Following World War II, Moller was cemented as a local curiosity, with local media celebrating Moller birthdays and events, company picnics, and other cultural events. I even found an old Maryland historical, it is historical now, but at the time it was a travel documentary encouraging tourism in the state of Maryland. And at the very end, they stopped in Hagerstown and they emphasized this pipe organ manufacturer. They never say the name, but it's pretty obvious who it is. Moller would go through a series of big labor contract strikes, a big one notably occurring in 1968. This would be something that reoccurs from time to time. Of course, it's not unheard of in industries, but it would be something that is important to note throughout its long history. Moller also, of note, as the 60s and 70s rolled around, was somewhat behind on the times as far as the rest of the industry, internationally speaking. For example, in the 1970s, Moller was still using a coal furnace to heat the factory to keep sprinklers from freezing, according to some workers. Now, this was also in terms of manufacturing process, whereas overseas, manufacturers were starting to use electronic components, and they could be done much more cheaply than a well-done handmade organ here in Hagerstown. There was even an article I came across where Moller workers across the country were lobbying the Nixon administration to put tariffs on imported organs and similar things. So these poor economic conditions at various times in the organ industry would result in fewer organ sales. Churches would not have the money to buy hand-built organs and were instead, as I said, interested in cheaper foreign-made organs. Since Moller was, as mentioned before, was its biggest player in a lot of ways, it took the brunt of this action. So in the 1980s, Moller particularly saw a host of problems arrive as far as its management and its employees. For example, with sales continuing to decline, management attempted to cut wages, and in the fall of 1988, workers went on strike what would become what I consider to be the biggest and ugliest strike of them all, the company's history, dragging into 1989. A couple of months after this issue had been settled, the last of the Moller relatives sold their stakes in the company to outside businessmen, ending Moller lineage from the start. So basically, the last Moller descendants washed their hands of the company and sold it to four men, notably Paul Coughlin, John Seneff, Roland Funk, and Harold Wright, who all bought into the company, hoping to modernize it. After their arrival, they made a longtime salesman Ronald Ellis the company president. There were even talks in this whole grand scheme of modernization. There were even talks of a new factory. Unfortunately, that never materialized, even though it was much needed. Following a short-lived hope of revival with the arrival of these gentlemen, the company exhausted many of its credit lines, and even after the new owners attempted to, or at least one of them attempted to float the company on their own dime, the employees were gathered into the erecting room on April 8, 1992, and informed that they did not have the money to meet the payroll. Some of them working for free for the last 2 weeks. Even still, to the very end, there was last-minute attempts at making Moller solvent again. Whether this was a Florida church attempting to send money for an organ that they were still hoping to get, the employee union buyout plans, and also the King Instrument revival in 1995. But despite these efforts, like I said, the company came to a complete and total close. Following Moller's closure, there was a huge auction that took place at that very factory, or as I like to call it, the gutting of the factory, the sale of the building to pay the company debt. A 4-day worldwide event where many former workers would come and have a rather gloom reunion of sorts. According to one Daily Mail article, many workers did not come to the auction to buy. Instead, they came just to see it all one last time before it was gone forever. This could not have been any more accurate. According to another article, one employee was quoted, a field representative this fact, told the Daily Mail, "I wanted to say goodbye to the factory. There's a great emotional attachment." Further still, another employee told the same interviewer, "I kind of wanted to go home and cry after witnessing the Moller auction." Now, I've rambled on here enough about the overarching history and how we get to the point of closure. Hopefully I painted a good enough picture for that. But now, we kind of need to get to the important part, and that is my oral history work. 2 summers ago now, I was grateful enough to, as I said, get to talk to a number of employees who work at both, Fairchild and Moller. Not only to talk about their lives in general, but I got to hear about their time on the job and things that went on in their lives after the fact, which I found to be very interesting. So without further ado, let's get on into this part. So starting out first with Mr. Plunkett, I'll give you a little brief introduction of all the workers, and give you some time maybe to read some of the quotes I picked out, some of that I thought were the strongest and most interesting. And I'll start with him. So originally from Hanover, Pennsylvania, not that long after moving to Hagerstown with his family, Terry's dad managed a food concession. And one of his food concessions happened to be handling the concession stand and the cafeteria at the local Fairchild plant. Doing this, he helped him and his brothers find a job at this plant, actually even his sister find a job at the plant. And for Terry, it was working specifically on the A10 Thunderbolt 2 assembly line in 1979. As a sheet metal mechanic and assembly installer, Terry helped assemble the tail wing structure of the A10 until he was laid off in the year 1982. Following his time at Fairchild, Terry continued to pursue industrial work at various industries in the area, including Rotorex in Frederick, Maryland, and Jameson Door, Hagerstown, Maryland, and Moller Industries after it took over Fairchild's bonding plant. Although he rotated between the three of these firms at various times, he ultimately found his new home at Jameson Door. Despite Terry's rough and tumble experiences I would describe with Fairchild and succeeding industries, he nonetheless recalled his own history at Fairchild with a sense of personal pride and patriotism, having felt that his work contributed to the defense of this country. Now, when I sat down for the interviews with these people, I did have a script, I did have a set series of questions I wanted to make sure I asked, some more important than others, but I tried to really just follow it as a flow of conversation. Usually more than enough information, usually more than enough time spent just talking about what they did on the factory floor, and as I said, my emphasis being after the fact. So, one of my favorite questions, just because it usually produced a unique and rich result, and something that I read in another study, was asking these workers why they thought their respective firms closed. Now, I wasn't asking them this question to get a verbatim Wikipedia article answer on obtuse, in some ways, economic descriptions as to why these industries closed, rather their own personal reasons. Some of them, as Terry, were pretty straightforward. You said simply, when you have contracts, you have work. When the contract runs out, you may run out of work until another one comes along. Sometimes we can fill the gap, sometimes they can't. Again, pretty straightforward. As I said before, that was one of the main reasons that was cited. Of course, other people will also mention that as well as far as contracts go. But given that that's Terry's example, he quickly got into other things. One thing that he quickly mentioned after that was talking about other people that he worked with. Now, Terry was the type of guy who always talked about others more than himself, talking about the achievements in others and how great the people were that he got to work with. But besides him on a personal level, it's really interesting to note when he said this. So he said, I love to share my experience with people, just to give them a glimpse of what it was like, and to be able to be with people and show how talented they were. There are so many people that I work with that had those talents and had pride in their work. What's really fascinating is he worked in a airplane factory. There was this idea that him and others that I talked with described the idea of this craftsman. Not really something that you would put two and two together with an airplane factory, but nonetheless, that was something that they mentioned. On another level, something else that was important about this specific part of the conversation was the people itself. There was this idea that these people were gone, they left, there were no more, whatever you want to call it. These people, like we said, that used to, how it used to be. People could say that that's a nostalgic take, but a lot of that has to do with this great exodus of people from the town, the community, following the company's closure. As I said, they couldn't find work in the area, which was very difficult at the time at certain points. They went somewhere else, and that was a great exodus of people from this part of the country. That's something, as I said, I saw a lot of just in general researching deindustrialization, but also from talking to these workers. Another thing that Terry talked a lot about, or not a lot about, but he mentioned as far as things that were lost goes, he lost this, in a way, this sense of pride, this sense of patriotism that you mentioned. As he said, so yeah, I kind of lost that too. Looking back, that was sad, You always have hope to keep that going. In some way, if you can help control it, but it's totally out of your control to be able to do that. And that was, as I said, Terry enjoyed his work. He enjoyed feeling that what the end product of his work was contributed to, let's say, national defense, or his own personal enjoyment, or whatever it was. Now, on a wide scale, Terry was unique in the sense that he wanted to also work for Rohr. Rohr, they made airplane parts and whatnot. And like I said, they took over the bonding plant that was right outside the main plant in Fairchild. And what was unique about that is that he was able to join a lot of other Fairchild workers, or I should say some, who were lucky enough to stick around and get a job at that plant as well. Now, the unfortunate part about that side of things is continue to enjoy the roller coaster ride of what was the aviation and aerospace industry at the time. One article that I read described someone's feeling as this deja vu for Fairchild workers. That is, their plant closed, you got another job. And what happened? There was a lot of talk of the Rohr plant closing. Terry aptly described this feeling of being caught in this cycle, as he describes it. No one wanted to lose their job. Nobody wanted to go back to the unemployment line and look for jobs again. It sucked, is emphasis added. Everybody hates that. You know, going through the whole process, no matter where you go, you're the new guy, you start at the bottom, you got to go through the whole spiel with the applications and the interviews. People don't know who you are, and you got to try to sell yourself. But what am I going to do with myself? Am I going to get another stupid job that's going to last me for another 2 years or more? How do I break this cycle? That's how I felt anyway. I couldn't say that was any more accurate. Again, talking to other workers, they felt that they were trapped in this cycle. They felt, as he said, got this job at this new plant. Hopefully it sticks around for at least a couple years, maybe enough where I can retire, maybe enough where I can have some savings. But fortunately, that wasn't the case. And Terry actually shortly found himself laid off again from Rohr. And again, that's when he would jump around from one to the next. At one point of our conversation, he just finally said, I felt powerless. Yeah, I pretty much felt that if their minds are made up and we're just peons, nothing's going to change no matter what he does. But that changed Terry. Having dealt with that in Fairchild, having dealt with that at Rohr, having dealt with that in other industries as well at certain points, he realized that, you know, despite how he felt about working in Fairchild, the patriotism, all those feelings, maybe that wasn't the most important thing in life. It helped him achieve things, but what he wanted more importantly was what he called roots. As Terry said, in this shift that he recalls, I wanted to have roots. I wanted to be able to raise a family in a place without travel. Because he knew that there wasn't going to be much for him in this area. And the further out he went, the more he was going to have to drive, the less time he was able to spend at his home with his family. In this sense, you could say that Terry lost his a sense of trust in this industry. Terry realized that he desired to have these roots that were more important than the type of work specifically that he was doing. If Fairchild had gotten closer to having roots in his family, then great. Otherwise, when it comes down to Fairchild was gone. He was able to move and refocus what was personally more important to him. One of the final things I got to discuss with Terry was, at the time, he was still working at Jameson Door. In addition to roots with his family, Terry eventually found a new professional home after bouncing around a few times at Jameson Door. And an important thing that he mentioned was, there's a 30-year board out there. It's got over 200 names on it, and it started in 1936. Which was just 30 years after it started, after Jameson Door was founded in 1906. So in the end, he was able to break that cycle, and he was able to find a home. Others, not so lucky, but for him, he was able to find something positive out of the whole mess. Moving on, Pam Ebersol. After living in Colorado and Hawaii for a stint, she soon realized that she wanted to move back to Hagerstown to be closer with her parents. They were getting older after all, and she wanted to spend more time with them and be closer to them. Shortly after arriving back in Hagerstown, Pam decided she would apply for a job at the Fairchild plant. Even though Pam's father also worked at Fairchild, she did not want her father to influence her job prospects, so she applied in secret. Eventually, she secured a job in production control at the main plant. Pam continued to work at Fairchild until 1983, when it was announced that the plant was shutting down. To further her education, Pam voluntarily took the layoff in order to receive money for schooling from Fairchild. Although Pam faced several personal issues during her tenure at Fairchild, she nonetheless has fond memories of her time and has contributed back to the community in a way by working in various capacities at the Hagerstown Aviation Museum. So just like Terry, Pam also expressed to me the role that she felt the contract issues played in Fairchild's ultimate closure and demise. However, in her case, it was not just a cycle, whereas you have contracts, you have work. It was Boeing themselves, in a way, that brought this upon Fairchild. Not that it was a malicious thing, however, it was the way that the business world works. As she describes, but when they pulled it, that being when Boeing pulled the work from Fairchild, they sent our company books, binders, on how to pull out the parts and in what order they wanted them pulled out. And I was surprised. I can see that when you're getting down towards the end, you write a book on how to do this. But I was shocked at the beginning of such a program that you would have those books already written, which means they always intended to do this. So it's interesting, as I said, talking with these workers, they had these ideas, or they had these experiences that made them really believe that there were other forces acting. It wasn't just simply the factory closed because the business was poor, but other actors, other influences were, of course, changing the way that things went. But her seeing that allowed herself to not see herself as a victim, rather just a player in a larger game. She even continued with the similar vein and the similar discussion, where she remembered talking to her boss about the new plant manager, a man named Marion Bud Miller, who had the reputation in the industry apparently as a plant closer. That is someone in management who they bring in to specifically close a plant. She recalls specifically her boss telling her, "You watch, this plant's getting ready to close." She thought he was crazy. That wasn't until the plant actually did close. Just as Terry did, albeit in a different way, Pam also discussed the wider phenomenon of this exodus of the workers and the ripple effects of deindustrialization. She said, "I think Hagerstown took a real hit when they left, that is the workers. I really do. I don't think anybody was prepared for Fairchild leaving. I have no idea how many people moved out of the county during this year, but I'll bet it was pretty significant." She went on during our conversation to talk a lot about how she felt, closed houses, closed businesses, like I said, different economic impacts that she felt that she could see. However, what was different with Terry's discussion of this was the intimate and personal details that she discussed on how this impacted her life. She says here, the old friendships, most of the people that I would have been interested in moved out, moved away. She talks at one point about a friend of hers named Kathy. She doesn't see her anymore now that Fairchild's closed or has been closed. So what's interesting about this is she starts to, I said, talk about these intimate relationships that she had with people, with friends at work. And they all left. There was no work, the plant was closed, they all moved away. And you can say, okay, all these people leave, whatever. But for her, these were her friends, people that she knew, people who she worked with. And that was starting to impact her on a personal level. But even more so was a moment during our conversation when she started talking about her father, who I discussed, worked at Fairchild as well. She just said this: "I always had a close relationship with my father growing up, but I had moved away, and I lived away for 9 years. When I came back and started working at Fairchild, I sat in meetings with my dad. To me, that was phenomenal. I found my dad was really brilliant. I ate lunch with him almost every day. I think my relationship with my father just got so much closer together having worked there with him." So in a way, Fairchild brought Pam and her dad closer together. Again, wasn't saying that she wasn't close to them before, but she clearly discusses this idea that they bonded more so. In fact, I didn't really include it on here, but I thought it was important to note that during my talk with Pam, she discussed the final years with her dad as he continued to get older and decline and develop dementia. The last things that he really remembered were these meetings. She told me how she would walk into the hospital and she'd say, hey, and he'd say, hey, we got that meeting today at 11 down at the plant. It had been a couple years since the plant closed. So in light of the closure of Fairchild and Hagerstown, Pam was actually offered a couple of jobs at various plants still owned by Fairchild, still run by Fairchild, across the country and even internationally. At one point, she was offered a job in Sweden. Instead of that, she chose to voluntarily accept the layoff in exchange for Fairchild to cover her education. As she said, well, I just had a decision to make, and I think I made the right one. I thought the education was more important because I was picking up my college classes, 1 or 2 a semester. This gave me a chance to get a lot more credits done. Something else that she interestingly noted was that her having taken that voluntary layoff saved a couple other jobs for other people in the plant. She called a couple employees coming up to her and actually thanking her for taking the layoff. You can imagine that, because they saved their jobs. Ultimately, not sure how those guys fared out after that, but needless to say, it's an interesting little tidbit. Of course, combined with this education, she talked a lot about the skills that other employees had, and she talked about the skills that she was able to learn. Ultimately, she said, all of my experience at Fairchild and reading blueprints and whatnot, because she was doing estimations and whatnot there at Fairchild job, helped her in her future endeavors. So while the plant was closed, she was able to maintain these skills and help her be successful to this day. So that concludes Pam's story now. And now we move on to Robert, or as I call it, Bob Gardner. Bob is a lifelong Hagerstonian. And from 1978 to 1987, Bob worked at Fairchild in Hagerstown as a manufacturing engineer. During his time at Fairchild, Bob also earned his MBA from Frostburg State University in 1982. While Gardner was president for and laid off following the closure of the main plant in 1984, he would continue to work for Fairchild through the bonding plant, and after that facility was sold to Moller in 1987. He remained there, as I said, until it closed in the 1990s for good. And before retiring, Gardner went to work at Lockheed Martin in Middle River, Maryland, doing a bunch of different jobs, as he called himself a job shopper, going wherever work was needed, but making a drive from Hagerstown to the Baltimore area. Following this, he began working for the Maryland Department of Business and Economic Development. As you see, this is rather ironic. Gardner was extremely proud of the time he spent at Fairchild, and one of the favorite little things that he told me was that he was extremely proud of his time, recalling that he used to, times, accidentally leave his Fairchild ID badge on after work, just so that other people could see it. Now, one of the first things that Bob wanted to discuss with me, and we discussed this at length on the phone and at length in person, was the earlier environmental issue that I discussed at Fairchild being involved in. As he said, this is something I'd like to talk to you about, and I hope you include it in your paper. Fairchild did not pollute. We talked about this on the phone, that all the pollution was coming from the old city of Hagerstown hangar. Following this, he emphasized a couple of key details. Ed Yule was not the most congenial person, Ed Yule being the chairman and president at one time. I never had the opportunity to talk to him because he was very brash. But he got into an argument with Stephen Sachs, that is the Attorney General of the state of Maryland at the time, and he, Yule, closed everything down, that being Fairchild and Hagerstown. Now, in Bob's opinion, Fairchild didn't pollute. Now, I'm not bringing this up to contradict him. I'm not bringing this up to say, oh, he's wrong, or to show you, well, hey, all this other research you have proves otherwise. That's not the point. As I said earlier, asking these workers why they felt these companies closed really tells something deeper, not just what happened, but how they felt, how they reacted, and what that says about the world around them at the time. Ultimately, Bob was not the only one who I talked to who felt this way about Fairchild. At least one other employee, a friend of Pam's, discussed it and said the same thing, essentially. He had praise for the company, he had praise for the community, didn't care so much for the leadership, but didn't care so much for the outcome of this pollution scandal. One interesting note that I found actually in a Daily Mail article came from the wife of a Fairchild employee, a woman named Vicki L. Keller. And she told the Daily Mail, rumor has it that Mr. Yule is behind a lot of this because of his grudge with the state. If you are, sir, I would like to know what pleasure you are getting by hurting innocent people. We did not find you. So as you see, Bob, though unique as far as my thesis, was not unique as far as blaming this incident on Fairchild's closure. Interestingly, he boils it down to a simple argument between state and Fairchild corporate. As he says in his quote up there, people so just sat down and discussed it and solved it, as they, fair enough, did in the past with other issues the company was involved in. You know, reading the court documents, because Fairchild was ultimately sued for this decision to close and all this other getting into the weeds of things, could never get a clear answer as to how much of this was true and how much of this was just conjecture and employees understandably being upset. Nonetheless, it's interesting just to think about. You know, we got to consider this. We live here in Hagerstown. We worked at the Fairchild plant. The plant closed. Maybe you were in the union. Maybe you weren't. Otherwise, the government, the union, the company's gone. That means the union's gone too. And the government can only do so much, if anything at all, to help you. So, like I said, unless you move, find work somewhere else, or lucky enough to find a job in your hometown, it's a pretty difficult situation, and it's understandable why a lot of these workers felt that they were, they got the raw end of the deal. So moving on, Bob at one point mentioned that he, sees the Fairchild plant still in Hagerstown. He sees it now as an empty place. As he said, I used to see a place that was full of people. Now it's just some place just sitting there, idle dormant. Bob was a very hands-on guy. He liked to see work being done. He enjoyed his work and all this other stuff. And the fact that now it's empty, something that really got to him. This, of course, also connects to the larger theme and larger idea that when there's no work to be done, people leave. Now, as Bob went on, said he still harbored these feelings of this, form of resentment with the Maryland state government. Also, I'm sure with Ed Yule and other people who were involved in Fairchild's leadership. Makes it all the more interesting, however, that eventually he went to work for the state. As I said earlier, he got a job at the Maryland Department of Business and Economic Development. And one of the great things that Bob said that he accomplished in his whole career was not even necessarily anything at Fairchild, as much as he enjoyed his time there. One of his greatest achievements, he said, was actually keeping Mack Truck here in Hagerstown. As he described to me, he was part of the team that helped maintain the jobs that Mack Truck did have. But actually, as he said specifically, he was able to keep 1,000 jobs here in the city of Hagerstown through Mack Truck. Now, I know it's a round number, and I checked this number in a couple different places, but I couldn't help but just think a little bit as a historian, as someone who analyzes things maybe a little too deeply. That Bob was part of this larger team that saved 1,000 jobs through Mack Truck. 1,000 people lost their job at Fairchild when the factory closed. So I couldn't help but notice that in a way that Bob was righting the wrong that he might have felt that Ed Yule or maybe the state had done at the time. Whether it was the perceived spike in closure and wrongful prosecution, or whether it was just. Regardless, he made sure to note that that was something important, something that he cared about. And however you swing it, it was something that benefited the community, and he was proud of it. Moving on now, MP Moller, someone who may or may not be familiar to some of you here in the room, Mr. Rick Morrison. Rick has always had the passion for music. While he was attending Shepherd University, he had begun working at MP Moore Playboy during the summer of 1967, and would continue working there during the summers of 1969. Although Rick had considered going to work for Moore full-time, following his brief time as a teacher, economic conditions unfortunately did not make that possible. That was until 1973, when Rick got a call from Vice President Peter Moller Daniels. And that's when he asked him to come back and work full-time with Moller in Hagerstown. From this time, as a summer hire in 1967 until the factory closed in 1992, Rick worked in various departments, including wiring, wind chest, and finally pipe hoisting. In addition to his normal job duties, Rick also served for a time as president of the Pipe Organ Builders Union local at Moller. From there, Rick took his wide range of experience and skills and joined 3 other Moller employees to form his own pipe organ making business, which continued into the early 2010s. Today, Rick is an organist at his local church and continues to service pipe organs in his spare time. Overall, Rick recalls that he really enjoyed his time working at Moller and always looked forward to sharing his stories about his time on the job. I definitely enjoyed hearing about his time. Like everyone else, as I keep saying, I started this story at the very beginning. He recalls, so they called us together and said, we don't have the money to meet payroll, so you're free to go. And that was it. Simple, sweet, and to the point. The last day at Moller. Now, as we started to get into it, I thought that opening was really interesting. As I asked him, initially he was talking about the financial issues that Moller was undergoing. But as I said, all that's on the surface. As I talked to him more, he began to say things like, so I just don't believe it was all handled very well. That is the management of the company. I think they should have really bit the bullet in the latter part of 1991 and reduced the workforce as much as they had to. Now, it's important to note here that this is not just a financial overview, this is not an economic overview. It starts to get into this idea that there's a management issue. And that was management on a personal level. Now, Rick doesn't so much get into it, but we'll see later that Moller management began to make certain decisions that didn't always benefit the workers, well, weren't always the smartest either. But nonetheless, it wasn't just the money issue. You could say it was just money, but people were involved here, so that's how that goes. So as I continued to also talk to him about the specific initial closure, Rick recalled that in the immediate aftermath of Moller's closure, he said he was shocked because the company had work. They had really worked with their people out in the field to go out and find work for the company. This is another interesting thing that I came across a lot in my research. These workers, these people at the plants were working out, they still had things they felt they needed to do. There were still things left unfinished. Regardless of what any other powers that be have to say, financial constraints, the fact that the company was closing down, its factory was going to be closed forever, there were still things that needed to be done. And of course, in an industry like MP Moore was in, things were all handmade, hand done. People took pride in their work. Of course, that unfinished organ, that wood chest that was only partially finished, or all those zinc sheets that still needed to be rolled in pipe organs, still needed to be done. Who was going to do it? Well, not that they weren't going to do it for free, but that fact is that psychological element to it. Yes, the company's closed, as I said, but there's still things that need to be done. Rick was even able to attend the auction that was the ultimate closure and selling of all the contents of the company factory, the equipment and whatnot. Something that he recalled is, you would ask yourself when it's really made you feel good. Besides this, obviously more clear feeling of loss that came to the thing of the auction, Rick discussed the form of loss and being part of the Moller process. That is, as he says, it's like everyone had a part. The company's opinion was everything was done and always has been done as a group effort. And that's something I think that a lot of people that work in the business can be proud of. Despite what some people might have wanted at the time, there was no signature Moller done by any one person. It was a group effort, all done under the Moller name. And a lot of Moller employees some that I talked with, always were proud to have that Moller name attached to them, or to be, as I said, part of that larger process. People working together. Different parts, you can have, as I said, the pipe roller, pipe hoister, you can have all these different parts. But they weren't just an assembly line, it was a shared mindset that they all got to be a part of. as I said, the in-house idea that was Moller. One of my favorite parts of my discussion with Rick was getting to talk to him about his business that he put on after the fact it closed, and that was Eastern Organ Pipes. As I actually have a nice little picture up here, outside of the old Moller factory, which is where they set up shop. As he says, it was one of the four of us that started Eastern Organ Pipes, which specialized in making pipes for organs. It wasn't really my idea in the beginning, but once the subject came up and the four of us got together, we decided to just go for it. As I said, they set up shop in the Moller factory. In a way, carrying on this Moller legacy that was thought to be lost, but it continued on through them. What's even more interesting is you think that someone like this, someone like Rick or other Moller workers who want to form their own work afterwards, they'd be chopping at the bit, that this would be the clear-cut answer. Rarely is that the case in history. The truth of the matter was that Rick was initially feeling a little apprehensive. Understandably so. This was a big jump from being an employee in a business to running the business himself. And as he told me, that came with its pros and cons. In the end, Rick and others, as you'll see, expressed the sentiment that I came across actually in a really nice article about another similar startup that was the Hagerstown Organ Company. Employees saying that they never envisioned seeing themselves or their own activities growing to become the new Moller of Hagerstown. Instead, they got to do what they love. They got to work with the organs, they got to work with their craft, but they never saw it becoming any big thing, even though people called it many times and asked if that was the case. They took the best parts of what they liked for working in Moller, and they left out what they considered bad, or at least in the most part what they could do. The last worker that I had the pleasure of talking to was Mr. Irv Lawless. Irv recalled that his mother had to physically pull him out of the inside of the pipe organ at their local church in Virginia. After working with other organ companies and going into business for himself, Irv was asked to come work for MP Moller Pipe Organ in 1987, to which he jumped at the chance and moved to Hagerstown. Irv remained at Moller, serving at various times as the assistant to the president, production manager, and finally tunnel director until the factory closed in 1992. Irv remained at Moller, finally, they said, tunnel director until it closed in 1992. In his post-Moller years, Irv returned to being self-employed under his own organ service, but he's still involved to a limited extent, at least at the time that I was writing. Although Irv did not always see eye to eye with the Moller company management, he still recalls his years there as being the most enjoyable of his long career. At the onset of my discussion and conversation with Irv, he shared this critical moment on the discussion with his friend David Shoemaker. Irv recalled, Dave and I came home from lunch, and he was an accountant. He said, I hope that check from the church comes in today or we're done. But when we came back from lunch, we got the call into the senior staff meeting, and both doors were closed, and that's when we knew the company had gone belly up. Now, as I have alluded to, Irv felt a tad bit, as you could say, of resentment during its closure. Irv felt that they'd done all this time and worked really hard to get to where he was at. Only that the management at the time, that is, as he says, the new owners, the problem with them is that they didn't understand the organ when it came to what they knew had to be outdated. They were trying to reinvent the wheel. There are certain things in organs you just can't change because it's a musical instrument. It's like going to a violin shop and start making violins at noon, because it's easier to do it when you can stamp them out. I think a lot of money was lost there. And he goes on to discuss a couple things, a couple experiments. He never really got into specifics, just experiments in general financially that Moller management attempted to do. Of course, the idea of the violins being stamped out of aluminum was a metaphor, or comparison, so to say. But the idea is this, is that he reflects a larger attitude that occurred with workers similar to this, in the sense that there was this disconnect between the new management, these guys coming in, trying to save the company, trying to do a good thing, of course, not altruistically through their own profit, of course, but they did try. However, they weren't in the working business, they weren't in the music business, they didn't really understand, so of course there was a major disconnect. And so things that they may have felt made good business sense just didn't make sense in the world of organs. In another instance, he describes this disconnect, as I call it, the one-sided arrogance and willful ignorance among certain owners. As he says, I think a lot of that towards the end, the new owners, who were just trying to save it, and didn't bend down to us lowly peasants who were organ builders. You just think about the music. Well, that's what's selling. In Irv's case, as I said, his initial feeling was he had come all this way, and now it's all gone. You have to remember that Moller was, despite it being a big industry in some ways, and its cultural significance in Hagerstown, that made it much more infinite when compared to industries like Fairchild. Everybody knew one each other on a different, more deeper level. You got to think 200 or less employees at the time of closing. Everybody knew each other truly. Irv talked a lot about the auction. When I got to the auction, I felt that the auction was probably one of the most unique aspects of Moller's history following its closure. Fairchild didn't have that, or at least not anything that I could think about. And in my time reading about other businesses and other factories that closed in and around the country, I hadn't come across anything so unique. Irv actually seconded Rick's feelings when it came to recollecting his experience with the auction. As he says, I went to my office the day before, that is the day before the auction, where you can go through and look at things. It was like looking down at your own foot and seeing a toe tag. Pretty telling. Looking down at his own foot, seeing a toe tag, usually in the morgue. So if you're seeing that, not usually a good thing. For him, in this case, it's a way of expressing that part of himself was going with the closure of the Moller factory. Unfortunately, Moller workers were not the only ones going to the auction. And in the auction setting, there was certainly plenty of competition with deep pockets, and Irv attests to this. According to Irv's testimony, some of this competition spawned from non-employees who came simply to buy something as a keepsake or a souvenir. In Irv's words, because Moller was so well known, people would buy a worn-out drill for way more than they could pay for a new one, because it was a piece of the true cross. Now, the imagery of the true cross, imagine that with a factory like the Moller factory, an industry like the Moller industry. It really shows the importance that not only Irv had for his industry, but also others surely had. Also, as it obviously shows what other people, the value that they put in the Moller industry. Much like Pam and much like Terry, they talked about, again, all the people who left on a smaller scale. Of course, there was job training and whatnot following Moller's closure. Something that was pointed out to me is that a lot of the Moller employees, they had also been working there for many, many years, some even before the war. So Irv at one point talked a lot about missing these people and where they went and what it was like to have all of these people certainly gone. As he says, the fact that, especially when I finally made friends there, it was becoming a smooth working thing with me and the company, because I wanted to know these people. I learned their names. Irv recalls one specific instance where he knew he had finally made it when he was invited to his first Moller birthday. Something, as I said, which became a big deal. They did have birthday parties up there in the lunchroom. And he described this one lady who brought a big pot of steamers, and he said, I knew I finally made it when I got invited to my first Moller party. Irv continued to go on to discuss about just being involved in the whole process. As I said with Rick, being involved in what I call the Moller process. Being involved, maybe indirectly, with the whole manufacture of the whole organ, even if it's just his own specific point. Of course, Irv is in a unique position to be kind of overseeing the whole thing. And as a highlight here, just as Rick did with his own company, so too did Irv go to his own venture. As he says, we were more into maintenance at this point because Moller had about 400 service contracts, and all of a sudden, churches didn't have anyone to call and rebuild their organs. So in a way, Irv filled this very important void that Moller had left. All these churches in this area and other specific areas needed work to be done. Of course, he was here, so he obviously has made business sense, but also it's unique to consider that he worked for Moller, and so too with the company. Now he was, again, taking care of the organs that he had, in a way, helped contribute to build. Something else that I really thought was interesting was Irv talked a good bit about how he interacted with the other companies that were startups that Moller employees at the time. Now, that wasn't anything unique, of course, as I've said. And it wasn't even the first, his was not the first company that started by former Moller employees. However, what I thought was interesting was none of these guys were in competition with each other. They weren't trying to drive each other out. They all did their own unique thing. One company worked on one part, one company worked on the other. In a lot of ways, they all helped each other. Either they helped each other grow, or they helped each other in ways to make up for shortcomings in knowledge and whatnot that came with trade. Irv specifically recalled helping Rick's company, Eastern Organ Pipes, with reading scale sheets. Now, as we get closer to the modern day, at the time of Irv and I's discussion, he left me with this thought, these words, in that I'm finding it's fading. We have a generation that has changed. You know, it's been gone 30 years now, and although you have younger organists who play mobile organs, they don't remember when it was ever up. That is the factory itself. And I'm finding because there's so many people changing in Hagerstown, they never knew what it was like. They don't know that there was ever an organ company here. Now, it's a sad thought to think that the memory of Moller is fading away. Of course, the Moller employees do not get any younger. That was one of the main motivations why I decided to do this type of history. Being to talk to the guys who are actually there, who actually experienced stuff like this. It's as important and unique as any other industry here in Hagerstown. It deserves to be remembered for a multitude of reasons. And as such, that's what I'm trying to do here. Now, so Irv discussed this idea that it's being forgotten. Thankfully, there are plenty of sources and plenty of things that hopefully prevent that. But nonetheless, that was his parting words with me during our conversation really stuck with me, and I wanted to share that with you all. So the epilogue. So here I have two photos. I have a photo of the Hagerstown Aviation Museum, and I have a photo of a truly unique piece of artwork here downtown, and that is the Moller sustained wings. Some of which certain Moller employees actually got a chance to work on parts of that art project. I actually got a chance to talk with the original creator of the sculpture as well. But the reason I have these two up here is because these two things, these two entities, whatever you want to call them, represents basically the current front line as far as the history and the memory of the respective companies that I discussed with you tonight. That is Fairchild Aircraft and Moller Pipework. Now, I'm not going to get too much into that. There's a lot to discuss with the memory and how I think and feel that these two are shaping the history and legacy of these two groups, and more importantly, what they're leaving out or including about workers and their own stories. So for that, I'll say you will have to read my thesis to get that part of things. But what I want to leave you all with tonight is this epilogue. This research that I'm presenting with you tonight, only a portion of what I found in my thesis, only a portion of what I found in total. but it's only the initial steps in understanding this side of history's past. The story is incomplete, but the patterns that emerge point to important shifts to help explain how the community has adapted in the decades following the closure of these two industries and deindustrialization as a wider phenomenon. While it has occurred on the national and international level, but I wanted to show the impact on people in our community, on the personal and intimate level, impacting not just their jobs, but things like how they saw themselves in their relationship with others. Just as I said at the start, the books and papers usually end with factories closure. Just as the end of my talk is by far from the end of this particular historical discussion. Of course, not all of this was positive. I couldn't say that this was necessarily a community build of peace. But it wasn't just negative for the sake of being negative. I wanted to discuss some topics that I've yet to discuss elsewhere, whether that was the Moller auction or the environmental issues that Fairchild was involved in. At the same time, the cheery parts were perhaps sentimental, maybe even nostalgic. But that, again, wasn't for its own sake. It was rather how these people and how these events, after the closing, were built. New lives for the people of Hagerstown, how they helped reshape our community, better or worse. That marks the conclusion of my talk. Thank you. Yes.
Where's the pipe sculpture?
It's out there on the cultural trail. And funny enough, I haven't actually really been to it myself, but it's out there down around the stadium.
It's across the street from the stadium.
Yes.
Stadium isn't built in that picture.
Yes, that is an older photograph. I should have said that.
It's Baltimore Street, before it goes up the hill in summer, that's, before the hill.
Right?
Yeah, one thing that really interested me about your talk is it's this interesting blend between this kind of bottom-up story and a top-down story, in the sense that it's about how common people on the ground interpreted managerial decisions and these kind of like big corporate plays. I was curious, like, what made you settle on this sort of perspective and how you see it as fitting into the broader literature around the Industrial Revolution?
Great question. So how I kind of came to that is how all great historians come up with any ideas, they read it somewhere else, right? So like I said, one of the most unique questions I did ask was when I said, how do you guys perceive these reasons as being closure? Whether they said the verbatim story or whether they tried to, came from anything from left field or just something I had not heard of, I had come across I forget where it was at. I think it was at an international harvester plant in Kentucky, where these guys that went around and done oral history interviews and discussed, hey, why do you guys do it? And they always got interesting answers. And I just kind of rolled with that. And that was a relatively recent, the studies of deindustrialization itself no longer really focus on the economic side or the overarching industry. It really is about the personal experiences of working on the ground. Sure, if you really dug, you would find the economics of it, but the wider literature, as you mentioned, really does try to dig deep into the intimate levels. And of course, to understand and really appreciate the wider history, you have to really kind of ground it in the, I guess, quote unquote, what actually happened, whatever you want to call it. But yes, the wider trend is to talk to people on that individual basis and see how each step along the way impacts them on a personal level. If that answers your question.
Yeah, of course, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you think, we articulate this study, do you think that as you met these people, got to know them, even in these conference studies, I'll pick one short, do you think that when you got to know the people in the culture, history, there was any emotional or sentimental tones or undertones to it that you got to know the people, establish a rapport, like maybe not in the beginning, but as time goes on, I can have
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And that's, I could talk all night about the theory and the ideas of oral history and all the ways that different people do it. There's not really one true method, but I read a handful of books and articles discussing how the theories and how, you should talk about it in order, you can jump around or whatever else. But yes, I mean, one of the most important things about conducting oral history is you don't just, pick up the phone and dial the number and get on the phone with someone and talk about their whole life story right then and there. Most of these people I talked to twice, if not once, but I talked to at great length. But it was involved in that. I found the people, and I called them up or emailed them, and I discussed what I was trying to do, what was important to me. But I also made sure to emphasize, I want to hear what's important to you. So again, as you said, the important part is building that relationship. And it's a really great byproduct that I'm fortunate enough to know all these people. Fortunately, Mr. Plunkett's no longer around, but I had the great opportunity of going to high school with his son. So thankfully, I had already known him a little bit more, so it was easier to talk to him and get into a little bit more nitty-gritty. But as I found, as you also suggested, getting to know these people more, they were willing to tell me more, and I was very grateful for that. So, not weeding through in a negative way, but picking up on the nostalgia and the sentimentalism of this all. It's important parts of the story, but it is important, as I said, to call that for what it is. It's nostalgia, it's sentimentalism, whatever you want to call it. But that all tells a part of their wider story.
So two things. First, a comment. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Your thesis, I think I wanted to read it. You still get to send it to me since you defended it. Plus. But anyways, my question is that what was like the sort of like vibe that these workers gave you about like the environmental impacts of these places? I know you mentioned that Fairchild had a major issue with contaminated water and something like that, and MP Moller was using a coal-powered furnace to keep the sprinklers and stuff like that. Did any of these workers discuss like environmental impacts on their health or anything like that sort?
Good question. Unfortunately, something that I actually thought on the onset I was going to get a little bit more into, but I didn't. What I read about with Fairchild, besides the issue and the aftermath and impact of that, Fairchild had run into issues like that before. Very similar, water being, they had this whole process of dumping the treated water into these plants on the property, and they were draining somewhere, and they were draining to the ground, but if it was treated, it was allowed. All this other stuff following the regulations. But unfortunately, besides talking with Bob about it and maybe talking a little bit about Pam with, general EPA regulations and whatnot, we never really came up with that. Now, if you know, I'll sidetrack here to a couple other little things. All the different industries in Hagerstown have had some kind of environmental impact, whether you read that from Fairchild, I'm sure Moller has in some regard. Notably, Central Chemical Corporation, there's a Superfund site out here in Hagerstown now. They were doing crazy stuff that I would say is crazy, like dumping DDT and arsenic into the water. And that wasn't found out until, after they had been doing that for years. And now, of course, there's higher rates of cancer going on with that. So it's another great and important topic that needs to be discussed, needs to be looked into. It's just, I could have probably written a whole thesis on that itself. So hopefully someone else, even if they end up completely tearing my thesis apart, hopefully someone else comes up and falls over that.
I have two questions. First of all, will a printed copy of your thesis be put into the collection of this library?
Don't know about printing, but I'll at least definitely be able to provide a digital copy because, speaking of environmental issues, my thesis is about 160 pages. So I'm going to do my part to save the trees on that one.
Frank, it's worth every printed page. Don't worry about it.
Appreciate it.
Second, I kind of want to go in the opposite direction, and I don't mean to be somber here, but I'm just curious. Did you encounter a lot of anger in any of these people, or in people they had known? In other words, how did people handle this sort of event? And sometimes things like that, these are people go into poverty or marriages break up and things like that. Did you get a sense for anything like that in your interviews?
Most definitely. Even if, like I said, Bob had his feelings on interaction with the state government and the environmental issues. And he felt that it was, almost as if it was an attack. At one point, I didn't really get into it too much, but that has impacted his political views. And of course, not to get into the politics side, but again, it's understandable, as I said earlier, when you're down and out, you have no job, the place that you used to work is now no longer there, so it's not like, oh, I can just wait until this cycle picks back up. It's, no, there's nothing that I can do. My union's gone, my factory's gone, and the government can only do so much, unemployment, those benefits until I can find somewhere else. So there was that with him. There was definitely with Irv, as he said, he had this really strong feeling of resentment. At least, he clearly displayed that when I was talking with him face to face, talking about those events, but definitely at the time, he really felt that he was screwed by, to use his words, by Moller management. And I'm sure that others felt that way. Like I said, I talked to at least one other Fairchild employee who didn't make it into my thesis, who flat out told me that he felt that Fairchild management and the government and all that stuff didn't care about him. And he felt that they didn't care about any other worker either. Talked about, there's an image, I found an image, I wasn't really too clear as the symbolism, but apparently in the factory there was this sign where they could put up, letters on it. And I guess Fairchild was making some kind of parts for the Challenger space shuttle. And someone had, according to the article, doctored the sign to basically say 1983 is a challenge for all of us. Again, showing some of that feeling. So yes, to answer your question, there maybe not directly in my workers that I got to talk to face, but I definitely came across a lot of instances of feeling of resentment, feeling of abandonment, feelings of anger. Just like that, again, that the wife of the wife, not even the worker itself, but the wife of the Fairchild employee felt that Ed Buell was taking it out on people of Hagerstown directly over something that they weren't really involved in one way or the other. So hopefully that addresses your question. Anyone else?
Please feel free to stay and ask Frank any other questions.
Absolutely.
Look at our displays, eat some food, and chat amongst yourselves. Thank you again for coming.